1924, while São Paulo begins its cosmopolitan ascent, with skyscrapers, wide roads, the hum of industry, there was a completely different Brazil, forgotten in time, hidden between the mountains of Minas Gerais. A country that almost nobody cared to preserve. Like so many Brazilian cities, the Minas Gerais countryside was born to serve the interests of Rio de Janeiro, the capital of Brazil from the country's founding until 1960. First as colonial outposts supporting sugar plantations. Then, during the Empire and the Old Republic, as the gateway to the gold mines. The first major Brazilian cities rose there, in the southeast, and as time passed, most people left for the big cities, hazing prosperity and new horizons. But one group of artists decided to go in the opposite direction. Mário de Andrade, Tarsila do Amaral, Oswald de Andrade, and Swiss poet Blaise Cendrars set out on a journey that no guidebook had ever mapped. While modern Brazil looked toward Europe, they looked inward, toward clay, stone, and the imprints of those who had built this country centuries before. The modernist movement had already exploded 2 years earlier, at the Week of Modern Art in 1922. But for Mário, the group's intellectual compass, that revolution was still unfinished. Brazilian modern art needed roots. And roots are not found in Paris. They traveled through the interior, recording daily life, humble routines, religious festivals, architecture that had outlasted empires. It was almost an act of archaeology. A rescue mission. To capture the soul of Brazil before it disappeared. Meanwhile, a young architect named Lúcio Costa was also making his way into Minas Gerais, but through a very different door. Born in 1902, Costa had graduated from the National School of Fine Arts in Rio de Janeiro in 1924, the same year as the modernist caravan's journey. At that time, he was a devoted practitioner of the neo-colonial style, an architectural movement that sought to reconnect Brazil with its Portuguese colonial roots, as an antidote to the shallow French eclecticism that dominated the Belle Époque. That same year, Costa was awarded a travel grant by José Mariano Filho, the movement's most vocal champion, to study colonial architecture up close in the historic city of Diamantina, in Minas Gerais. He went there as a neo-colonialist. He would not stay one for long. Then they arrived in Ouro Preto. And everything changed. Mário de Andrade had never seen anything like it. In the letters he wrote afterward, he described an emotion of discovery that was almost painful, like finding something you didn't know you were looking for. The churches of Ouro Preto and Mariana were not relics. For him, they were proof that Brazil had already created something genuinely its own. And at the center of it all, Aleijadinho. The sculptor who, with hands deformed by disease, had produced works of such originality and force that they owed nothing to Europe. For the modernists, Aleijadinho was Brazil's first great artist, a modernist before his time, through sheer courage, rupture, and Brazilianness. As Mário himself wrote, Baroque architecture in Minas had taken on a more defined character, and we might say, a far more national one. Lúcio Costa's own encounter with Minas Gerais planted a similar seed, though it would take a few more years, and one crucial influence, to bloom. In 1929, the Franco-Swiss architect Le Corbusier visited Brazil, giving lectures in São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Buenos Aires. His book Toward an Architecture had already begun circulating among Brazilian intellectuals, outlining a manifesto for a new kind of building, one that aligned aesthetics with function, geometry with human life, and modernity with national identity. For Lúcio Costa, it was a revelation. He began to see that what he had admired in Minas, the clean proportions, the honest materials, the absence of ornamental pretense, was not a relic of the past. It was a prophecy of the future. The Baroque simplicity of those mountain churches and the rational clarity of Le Corbusier's modernism were not opposites. They were kin. And it was Mário de Andrade who had first taught him how to see that. But in 1924, Ouro Preto was not seen as a treasure. It was seen as a problem. Local authorities wanted to modernize the city, tear down the old, open new avenues, build forward. A Brazil ashamed of itself was on the verge of erasing its own handwriting. Mário de Andrade didn't let it happen. By 1936, working within the Vargas government as director of the Department of Culture in São Paulo, he authored the draft legislation that would create the National Historical and Artistic Heritage Service, the IPHAN, later known as IPHAN. For the first time in Brazilian history, a law declared that a people's cultural identity had legal value worth protecting. Lúcio Costa became the man who would turn that vision into stone and policy. In December 1930, he had been appointed director of the National School of Fine Arts, the very institution that had trained him, backed by the support of Rodrigo Melo Franco de Andrade, who would later become SFAN's first director. Lúcio immediately set about dismantling the old curriculum and inviting modernist architects to teach, provoking a fierce backlash from the neocolonial faction led by José Mariano Filho, who eventually forced him out. But the dismissal didn't end Lúcio Costa. In 1935, he was called back to lead the team that would design the new Ministry of Education and Health building in Rio, a landmark project that brought together Oscar Niemeyer, Afonso Eduardo Redi, and others. With azulejos by Candido Portinari and gardens by Roberto Burle Marx, the building became the most powerful symbol of Brazilian architectural modernism. And Lúcio Costa was its intellectual architect. From that position, he served for decades as the technical backbone of IPHAN, ensuring that the preservation of colonial heritage and the advancement of modern architecture were not contradictions, but two sides of the same Brazilian identity. In 1933, Ouro Preto was declared a national monument. In 1980, it became the first Brazilian site inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. Think about what might have happened if Mário had never made that journey. If the modernist group had kept looking only at Europe for inspiration, Ouro Preto might have been demolished. Mariana, forgotten. Aleijadinho reduced to a name in a textbook, with no churches left standing to look back at us. And Lúcio Costa might have remained a competent neo-colonial architect, building tasteful imitations of a past he had never truly examined. Instead, the encounter between those two artistic journeys, one through the interior of Minas, and one through the intellectual life of a generation, produced something that no single person could have built alone, a country that decided its history was worth keeping. As Lúcio himself would later reflect, architecture in its truest form does not lie. It does not imitate. It reveals. And what the Baroque churches of Minas Gerais revealed, to Mário, to Tarsila, to Lúcio, and to the country that followed, was that Brazil had always had a voice. It just needed someone to stop and listen. Here at Brazilian Literature, we believe that literature doesn't stay inside books. It is written in stone, in lime, in wood carved by hands long gone. And it only survives if someone decides it's worth saving. In 1924, those people were Mário, Tarsila, Oswald, and their companions on the road. And Brazil is still standing because of them. Which of these historic cities would you most like to visit? Tell us in the comments. And if this video made you feel proud of Brazil, share it,